to your steps of obedience. It'll pave your way into the promise.
Hi. We've come to the end of an agricultural cycle in what people call a Hebrew year or a Jewish year. And we are standing at the beginning of another agricultural cycle, or a Jewish year, or a Hebrew year. Now, there's been a lot of speculation about this particular year. We are now in 2015, and a lot of people have been saying that we're going to have some catastrophe economically that'll happen globally, that there will be a global economic collapse. There's even been a lot of speculation about specifically the 13th of September. There's also been some questions about the 23rd of September. And so a lot of this is driven by how people interpret what we call the shmita, or the Sabbath year. Now, I want to say that when I look at all of the speculations that people have, I'm sometimes a little bit concerned about the statistics that people use concerning this, and where people now want to force an economic collapse on the 13th of September or the 14th, which will be a Monday. And so I'm not exactly of the opinion that these statistics are exactly correct. What I do want to say is that when I look at what world economists are saying and their way of approach and all the cycles that they are using, and there are 4 very prominent cycles which they use to measure this, then what it does say is that we are in a time where it's very likely that there will be some kind of disaster economically. Some people are predicting it for the second half of September. Some people are predicting it for the beginning of October. And so when we go and look at the scriptures in Leviticus chapter 25, we see that the commandment is given concerning the shmita and the yovel. The shmita, let me just explain that, is a 7-year cycle. 6 years they're allowed to do agricultural activities in the land, but on the 7th year it's a Shabbat year, and that year they should let the land lie and not work the land. God then promises, and he says, when you come to the 6th year, this year I will give you a double portion, or a double harvest. Now, normally you would have 7 of these cycles, and then you would have a 50th cycle, which is called the Jubilee, or the Yovel. And then he promises, is in that 6th year of the 7th cycle, I will give you a triple harvest that will sustain you through the next 2 years that you're not allowed to work the land. Now, there are 2 very distinct commandments or instructions concerning this. And that is that at the end of the shmita cycle, in other words, this 7th year in every one of these 7-year cycles, that they have to have a debt release. So let's say I borrowed money from you. You then have to look at what year of this cycle we are in. I can then pay that back up till the 6th year. But if you think that I will not be able to pay this, then you will not give me this loan. But if you think I can do it, you will give it to me. But when you get to the end of the 7th year, whatever I owe, you have to release that debt. And this is actually what the word shmita means. The word shmita means a release of debt. When you get to the 50th year, a jubilee, then you also, if you would seize my property because I don't pay, you have to then in the 50th year give me back my inheritance so that I can start over again in my inheritance. That's the basic two instructions. It's a release in the 7th or at the end of the 7th year, and at the end of the 50th year, it is the idea of a redemption of the land to bring back the people to their inheritance. Now, a lot of people have been saying this year is a shmita, and it's very definite that this is a shmita. I can just look at what happened last year in Israel, where we live, and there we saw that there was a definite double portion of a harvest for the people who are keeping the shmita, which to me is like God keeping his side of the promise to those who are keeping his word. The question now arises, is next year a Jubilee? A Jubilee? Well, I want to say I disagree. I do not believe that 2016 and 2015, 2016, this next year, is a Jubilee. And there are certain reasons why I say that. We only have 2 scriptures in the Bible that gives us an indication that it was a Jubilee in that year, and that is actually dated, that we can put a specific date to. Well, if I say specific date, then it's an estimated date because we can be wrong. But the first one is in Ezekiel 40, verse 1, where it says, in the 25th year of our captivity, 14 years after the city was smitten, or that the city fell, it says, on the 10th of the month, Rosh Hashanah. Now, the Bible explicitly tells us that Rosh Hashanah is on the 1st of the 7th month, not the 10th of the 7th month. So why is Ezekiel saying that this is the 10th of the 7th month? Well, if you read Leviticus chapter 25, you will find out that when you get to a Jubilee, then the declaration of that Jubilee is not on the 1st of the 7th month, but on the 10th of the 7th month. And then Rosh Hashanah coincides with this whole idea of Yom Kippur, which is the 10th day. And we then see that in Luke chapter 4, that Yeshua was in the synagogue in Nazareth, and he actually made the Jubilee declaration. So when you take those two, we can work out when the next Jubilee will be. And according to Genesis, where God says he gives us 120 years as man here on earth, then it's not 120 agricultural years. We know we've been around for more than 120 years. My own grandfather was born in 1885, and just from there to where we are now, it's more than 120 years. So it's not 120 agricultural years. It's also not 120 shmita cycles, which would be a 7-year cycle times 120, would then give us an estimate of 840 years. We know that man has been around for more than 840 years. But then there's only one more type of year in the Bible, which is a Jubilee. That's a 50-year cycle. And if you say 50 times 120, that gives you 6,000 years. That also lines up with all of the rest of the scriptures that says that God has given man 6,000 years here on earth. So Is next year a Jubilee? Well, if it will be a Jubilee, then it must be the 120th Jubilee, because it's 6,000 years now since the creation of Adam and Eve. And then a certain lot of other prophecies must also now have gone into fulfillment. Then the temple must now have already been built. The tribes, the lost tribes of Israel must have returned to Israel, which we don't see that has happened yet. Then we see that we should be in the last 7 years, which is the 7 years of tribulation. However you would want to divide that, whether it would be 7 years or 3.5 plus 3.5, but at least we would be in that last 3.5 years, where we would not be able to buy and sell unless we have a number. Then we must have been confronted by it to already have a number, either on our hand or our forehead. The Antichrist must have been revealed already. There are just countless more prophecies concerning those last 7 years that should have been in place already, which is not. Elijah must have shown up in Jerusalem. The 2 witnesses must have been. I can continue on and on and on and on. Now, all those things just tell us that this can't be the 120th Jubilee. If next year is a Jubilee, then we should be in the 119th Jubilee cycle. Then we should not even be worried about this, because then we're 50 years away from the 120th Jubilee. But if we say we are in the end of days, and then say there must be an economic collapse linked to the end of days, then we must be close to cycle 120. And if we look at the dates that we have dated the Babylonian exile at, and take 14 years away from the destruction of the temple, which was in 886, that's the commonly accepted time, then we must be at least 7 years away from another Jubilee. However, if we look at Luke, then, and we take into account that Yeshua was about 30 years old when he started his ministry, and now it's probably the year 29 when he starts it, dating the time of Herod's death to the 90 days that you need between where he killed the 2 priests on the altar up till where his son had to go and get his kingdom and ask for that at Rome, because you can't put it into a 30-day, you can only put it into a 90-day cycle. Then the birth of Yeshua must have been around about -2, dating it to that lunar eclipse in the year 1 before the birth of the Messiah, well, according to the Gregorian calendar. So all of this tells us that the next Jubilee must either be in the year 22, 23, or in the year 29, going to 30. That means that next year cannot be a Jubilee. However, if we look also at the scriptures in Leviticus chapter 25, we see that there's a difference in interpretation between how some of the rabbis look at it and how some of the others rabbis look at it, because this declaration of the Jubilee we know is on the 10th of the 7th month. But some of the rabbis say, no, when we look at that portion, it actually indicates that the debt release was also not on the 1st of the 7th month, but on the 10th of the 7th month, which would then put the 23rd of September 2015 to be the date of the debt release, because this year was a shmita. Now, if we accept this was a shmita, then either the 13th of September 2015 or the 23rd of September must be the date of the debt release. And so within Christian circles, there's been a lot of speculation that's been flying around that there will be an economic collapse, worldwide economic collapse on either the 13th or the 23rd, or somewhere in this time frame that we're in. My problem with how people see this is that if that is true, then that is a judgment which will affect the believers, and that will bring us to a point where it's not just a debt release, but it's a judgment, and which will put all of us into very difficult times. And that's not consistent with the typology of what the shmita is really all about. Now, do we think that there will be a global economic collapse? Well, let's just consider for a moment that there are a lot of world economists and financial advisors who's been saying this for the last probably 5-6 years already, that there is something that's going to happen concerning the dollar as a reserve currency. And one of those guys which I esteem very highly in how he's been looking at from the statistics that they've been keeping, from the way that they've looked at it, is Jim Ricketts, who is the financial advisor for the Global Economic Warfare Committee, and he's connected to the White House and the CIA. And he's been being quoted even in the government as a reliable source, and he has also been quoted when they refer to what the state of the federal bank is, Federal Bank of America is. Now, Jim has been warning people that we are on the brink of a 25-year worldwide depression. So why is he saying that? And this is really the basis of all of the speculation that's been going on. And if you look at all of the world economists who has been warning about something like this, then it all revolves around one thing. That one thing is that it is going to be the fall of the dollar as a world reserve currency. Now, we know that previously, till after the war, the World War II, the pound was that world reserve currency. But the thing that tipped the scale concerning that was when the world started needing excessive amounts of oil, crude oil, to have energy for vehicles, for airplanes, for everything that moves almost. And so they negotiated that all of this oil will be sold in dollar, and from there we get the term of the petrodollar. The petrodollar was not connected to gold, so there was no tangible commodity. Now, what it's connected to is something called index, and index really means supply and demand. So when you have oil that is now supplied and you have a demand for that oil, the price of that oil is connected to the demand for it. So if I have 100 barrels of oil and I have a demand for 200 barrels, then the price will go up. But if I have 100 barrels of oil and I only have a demand for 50, the price will go down. That's the basis of this. So the problem around this lies on two levels. The first level that it lies on is the level of debt. In the last couple of decades, and especially in this last generation, people have increasingly started living on debt, where previously this was not so. And this debt is the first big problem concerning the the dollar as a reserve currency. Now, if you just look at America, America has about $17.5 trillion of debt. That's a lot of money. And they have about $127 trillion of liabilities on top of that, which puts them in a very, very, very bad situation where they will never ever be able to pay that debt. It's not possible. If you look at their GDP growth, then currently for every dollar of debt that they have, they only create about 3 cents of GDP. Now, it's just such an imbalance that you can't work on that. That is what they call a bubble and a burst economy. That economy cannot sustain itself. And so they've been printing dollars because people wanted to buy oil, and based on the demand of that, there's been a lot of dollars in circulation. Now, the liability of America is about $77 for every $1 of collateral that they have. They've lent out $77 based on every $1 of security. Now, any bank, if you would go to them today and you would say to them, I want money, and they say, what can you give as security? And you want $77 and you can only give $1 as security, they will say, no, you can't do that. But the World Bank has been trading on that. Whereas another world institution, which is the IMF, has been working on 3-to-1. In other words, for every $3, they've got $1 of liability. Of every $3 of liability, they've got $1 of collateral for that. Now that's much more healthy. It's much better. In other words, if I would go to them and say, give me $3, and I have $1 of security for that, then that's the basis that they've worked on. Now, recently we've seen the crisis in Greece, where the IMF actually bailed out Greece against debt that Greece had towards them, which doesn't make that much sense that you can actually bail out somebody for debt against yourself. But it just shows you that this has been happening, where debt was extended to people without security that really backs that debt. So if that person would go bankrupt, that institution will just lose the money. Now, in America, you currently have about $60 trillion of debt that the banks have granted to their debtors. That's on their books. Now, that means it's a society that's driven by debt. And if you look at all of the value of the stocks on the stock exchange in America, then it's 203% in comparison with their GDP. Now that again is a danger sign. You can't have that. Now I know that all of this sounds a lot or very technical. The fact is that these figures tell us that the American economy is at the place where it just can't go on like that. So any economist looking at this will say, something has to happen. Now, you don't need to be a prophet to see that. It's facts. It's just absolute facts. And the value of the stocks in the stock exchange in any country is fundamental to the economy of that country. So, because that's the value of what they say companies are valued at, public companies. Now, also, you need to realize that there is nothing that really backs the dollar except for the demand that is there for it to buy oil. And there are 3 countries now that has been affected in their relationships with America, and are now teaming up to say we should not have the American dollar anymore as the reserve currency. And that's Russia and Saudi Arabia, both of them selling huge amounts of oil, and also China. And it's interesting that in the last 5 years, China and Russia and also India has bought extreme amounts of gold. Some people want to say that they bought probably about 80% of the gold that became available on the market. So why are they doing this? Because they know that this economy of America can't last. The big problem globally is that all of the currencies in the world are now backed by reserves of dollars that their reserve banks are keeping. And that means that if the dollar would fall, then all of that will become worth zero or very little in those banks. And then the value of that currency will be very little, because it's in a direct relationship to the value of the dollar. Now, what also is contributing to this is that about a year ago, in August last year, 2014, you would still pay between $90 and $100 for a barrel of crude oil. In other words, the world out there needed between $90 and $100 for a barrel of oil. Today, a year later, you need $40. So you only need half the dollars, or less than half the dollars, on the world markets to buy oil. So supply and demand, even if the demand for oil is still exactly the same as last year, even if it's more, you need less dollars. So they've printed dollars that are now worth nothing. It's not being used. It's lying around. Now, here is the scenario, and that is that if I would go out and I would go and eat somewhere, and I would tip and this is what Jim said, which I liked. I really liked this example. He says, if I would tip the waiter, and the waiter takes some public transport to go home, and he pays with that tip, and that taxi driver takes it and goes and buys something to live off, then it means that that dollar has now been used 3 times for a service or a product. So that dollar has really been active. But if I take dollars and I let it lie somewhere and I'm not using it, then it's excess dollars, it's not producing anything. So half the dollars that was needed a year ago to buy oil is lying somewhere. Nobody needs it, because the dollar price that has, the oil price that has fallen so much. So are we heading for a global disaster? I think so. Is it connected to the shmita? I don't think so. Because the shmita has to do with a release of debt, not with a global collapse. The global collapse will bring difficulty for everybody, not release them of their debts. And that is my problem with the scenario of looking at the shmita as now the connecting thing. It might be that there's been a lot of times where global collapses was connected to the shmita or to the time where that shmita was, but we can't take that and now say Because there's a shmita, there must be a global collapse. Because then we are applying the shmita in a wrong way. Then we're applying the shmita as a judgment on all people and not a debt release. Now, I'm not a financial advisor. All I'm doing is I'm listening to what other people are saying. But I think the real problem is if I would have an investment on the stock exchange which was invested in some kind of financial service. In other words, there's no real commodity linked to it. It's trading that's linked to it. And as long as there's supply and demand, and that the demand is bigger than the supply, then I will do well. But there's nothing that's produced except for paper money. But if I had stocks in a company, that company is producing some product, then it doesn't matter if on paper I lose some value in my stocks. If I keep it long enough and the cycles turn, I might still get my value back. But I still have those stocks in a company, I'll still get my dividends. And that company still has value because the company is producing something that people want. It's not just some paper money somewhere. And so if there's a global disaster that has to do with currency, which is paper money and its figures, then I think the real problem to me lies in these type of financial companies where there's no production of anything tangible. The question is still, what should we expect as believers and how do we prepare ourselves? Well, I want to say this. If we look at the Bible, we look at what we generally call the Old Testament or the Torah and the Haftarah, as it's called in Hebrew, then whatever we read there are like shadows and types of that which we will see also in the reality with Yeshua as our Messiah. And it'll play out in a prophetic way. And one of those shadows and types is that of Joseph. And we see with Joseph what happened was there were 7 very good years and then 7 years of famine where the people lost everything. Just to be able to live, they had to sell everything to get food, and it was a time of persecution actually for the world. Now, if I look at Ezekiel, and I say that maybe the interpretation of Ezekiel 40 verse 1 that it was not a Jubilee, but rather a shmita in which he wrote it, then it can tie up with Luke chapter 4, which we know must have been a Jubilee because Yeshua made the Jubilee declaration, and then the people said, "Oh, is this the Messiah?" Because in the Jubilee, the Messiah, whoever would be the Messiah, God would choose that person. He would be the 8th person to read in the synagogue, and he would read from the prophets, or the Haftarah as we call it. And we see that that's exactly what happened to Yeshua. A scroll was handed to him. He didn't pick it. It was Isaiah 61 that he read. The Spirit of the Lord is upon me. And then he made the declaration. He went and he sat down. Everybody was looking at him, which was the custom in every synagogue on that particular day in the Yovel on the 10th day of the 7th month. And then he said, "Today this word is fulfilled in your hearing." He made the Jubilee declaration. Only after that they said, "Oh, can this be the Messiah?" "No, we don't think so." And they wanted to kill him. And so we know that must have been a Jubilee. If that is true, then the next Jubilee is only about 14 years away. Now, I could be wrong. But we at least somewhere in that ballpark figure. And I'm very curious not to put dates to things because, we could think that we have the calculation right, but we could be wrong about it. So what would I expect in this time to come? If that which I see, this shadow and type of what I'm seeing, if that is correct, then I think that we have 14 years that lies ahead that's going to be very interesting. 7 years of plenty. So from tomorrow onwards, expect a harvest. That's what I would say. Even if there's a global collapse. But the key would be to get out of debt. Because debt is the thing that will put you in a very bad position. If you don't have debt, you are not going to be affected as those who have debt. So let's get out of debt. That is the first thing I want to say. And the second thing is expect a harvest, because there must be 7 good years before there's going to be 7 terrible years. And so in line with the normal greeting of the new year, which would be have a good year and a sweet one, I want to wish that to you. Let's prepare ourselves. But to be able to get to that, we need to listen and do. Listen and do. Just listen to what the Father is saying. You know, why is it that we as believers are so eager to believe all the bad things that will happen and then see all of the bad scenario of what will happen and fear? If we believe that God is in control and if we are listening and obeying Him, then we must be in the place where we can say we can trust our Heavenly Father to provide for us. Even if the worst of the worst would happen, we can still say we have hope. And our hope is in God. Our hope is in the Father. Our hope is in that which Yeshua did. And we don't have to fear. If the Father could provide for the children of Israel bread in the desert for 40 years, don't you think He can provide for you? He hasn't changed. So I'm not looking at this time with fear in my heart and trembling and saying, oh, this can be a very bad time. No, I'm looking at it and I'm saying, hey, I'm serving a Heavenly Father who loves me so much that He's given His Son, that I could be set free from my guilt, that I could have my shmita, where the guilt and the debt that I had against Him was erased. And I'm looking forward to a wonderful time of restoration. Wonderful time of God's blessing. I must just listen and do what He tells me to do. And then the principle of the shmita will work in my life. I'm released of my debt. And then the principle of the Jubilee, the Yovel, will work in my life. I will be restored back into my inheritance. To be man, created in the image of God, living from His likeness, in which I can make decisions, in which I can be fruitful and enjoy the life of God. So, to all of you, I want to say, Lashana Haba. May this be a good year. Lashana Tova B'metika. Good year and a sweet one for you. Because we are listening and obeying His voice.
The wine goes down sweetly for my beloved, moving gently. the lips of sleepers.